Welcome to TechWire, a conversation about government, politics, and technology. My name is Christina Gagnier, and today I'm joined by Reilley, a VP for Agile and Talent at IBM. Sean, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
So you were here today as a keynote speaker at the CIO Academy for California.
Yes.
What did you share with the people attending the conference?
Well, it started with a little bit of introduction of what we're doing at IBM, because it's very relevant and very, very much relatable to what the state of California is looking at. And so my role at IBM is really to drive Agile adoption. So think about it, a big company like IBM is not too different in the state of California. How do you drive new ways of working across the company? That's one piece. The second piece is about talent, right? How do you change your people? How do you change the talent of your people to adjust to those ways of working? And then the underlying processes and technology, that'll come with it. But you really have to think about the overall work, the overall cultural change that's needed, both in terms of the actual work itself with Agile, but also leaders. What does it mean for leaders? What do they have to do differently?
So you're in the private sector, so you're on the outside looking into government as they're making this transition. What are your thoughts on how it's going or where you see it going in the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, I am in the private sector. My role is an internal transformation role, right? So taking the same concepts, when I'm reading some of the things at TechWire about what the government's doing, I see a lot of ourselves in it, right? A lot of the journey that we've been on and we've been going across. I think there's a couple key areas that people have to think about as they're getting started and as they're driving through. The first is how do you form teams, right? How do you look at teams differently? It's different than the way that other teams are structured. You have smaller teams, right? They're cross-functional. They can deliver things end to end. The second piece is about how do you manage work, right? So you don't take the work and these big things, you got to break it down into smaller pieces so you can deliver things in iterations and sprints and smaller chunks. And then the third thing is measurements. You have to figure out what matters and measure what matters so that the teams can get better. When I look at the government, it's no different. You have the same exact setup, you need the same exact actions. And the question is, where do you want to go and how quickly do you want to go on that journey?
And what is some advice you can give to our audience, CIOs, people in IT, for implementing Agile technology? I mean, I'm sure we have people out there that are working in smaller departments and agencies who, are clamoring for this, but maybe are meeting some opposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's a couple aspects. The first thing I would say is that you want to start at a higher level, right? So a lot of people will go on an Agile journey and say, here's what I want to do, here's the tools I want to implement. And that's not enough. It's fine, and you could do that for some teams, but you got to start much broader, right? So what are the core values, principles, and practices that anyone can be doing across the organization? So it's not just a technology shift. You're changing the way people think, the way people act, the way people behave. So that's one thing. The second thing I would advise for people to do is just get started, right? There's many reasons why you can't. When you look at a hierarchical group or a traditional command and control organization, you can have 100 reasons why it's tough to do and why it's hard to get started. But you got to start somewhere. You got to pick a person, you got to pick a team, you got to pick a group or an organization and just drive it forward. And so if you can do that, then you'll start seeing, a snowball effect. You mentioned, right? People want to do this. People want to work this way. They hear about it and they're energized and they're passionate about it, but they don't feel like often they have the permission to do it. Well, then just give them the permission and you'll start seeing the effects. You'll see people changing the way they work and you'll start seeing the outcomes change. You'll start seeing the effects of the change in the way that people work and what they're able to deliver.
So you made a bit of an analogy between IBM and what's happening in government, both big institutions in their own merits. So in terms of this conversation, culture change comes up a lot, and the idea that there needs to be some huge culture change in government. Since you've been internally, focusing at IBM on, this being a cultural change, what do you think some of the parallels are between, and what do you think people mean by culture change?
Yeah. So I think that when people talk about culture change, it often becomes this soft topic, right? And quite honestly, when you hear people talk, it often feels like an unachievable goal, right? Especially for big institutions or companies that have been around for a long time, or for government agencies. I think of it slightly differently, right? I think of it, culture is really just an embodiment of the way people think, the way people act, the way people work, right? If you can change things in that realm, you can slowly change the culture. It's not just putting posters up to say, this is how our culture should be, but rather start with that, start with the values, start with some key principles, but really think about what are the ways people work, what are some of the things, what are the practices they do, and can you start changing some of those practices? If you do that slowly, maybe quickly in some instances if you're aggressive enough, over time, you'll start seeing people behave differently. That's when you start getting to culture change, and that's when you start seeing it happening at scale, right? But it doesn't happen just by mandating it or dictating a culture change. You actually have to change the behaviors of the people and the roles and the jobs and what they do.
I notice your role is agile and talent. I think a big part of government adopting agile technologies might be hiring new talent, hiring people that are familiar with those technologies. Do you have any insights for government agencies on the talent piece of it?
Yeah, no, it's great. So it's interesting because when I took on the role, the agile piece was more clear, and they said, okay, but we also want you to think about the talent side. And so when you look at it for the CIO organization, which is where I work, right, and think about the talent there, this is not, there's HR programs that are out there, but we also work with the HR teams to think about how do we develop our people. So it's one thing to say, hey, you should change the way you work, or hey, here's something that we think is applicable for you. It's another thing actually to help the teams change. So whether that's rotating people into different roles, whether it's changing the way we think about leadership or the way that people are performed, people's performance is measured, right? These are all things that have to change as we go through the transformation. So, we partner closely with our HR teams to say, how do we do that for the organization and how do you push it forward? But that role of talent and how do you change the talent, how do you change the people, the mindset, the skills of the people is as important as the message itself as you drive forward.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
All right, thank you.
And thank you to our audience at TechWire for joining us once again in a conversation about government, politics, and technology.